It's wonderful to be here. I'm Yvonne Wassenaar, and it is my great pleasure to have Lara with us. Lara and I go way back, and we have a lot of different connection points. My goal, because I'm a huge Joe Montana fan, and I didn't realize how funny he was, is not to make you laugh, but hopefully to bring forward some of the stories and skill sets that will enable you to buy the Super Bowl tickets yourself versus just billing them to your company and saying it's for clients and customers. Because I used to be CEO and I don't buy it. The number of times my head sales rep is like, I need to go to the Super Bowl. I'm like, yeah, buy a ticket. I pay you a really big check. So let me introduce Lara. I had to write this all down. And then her PR person told me, no, you have to put some other things in there. So it's small.
Oh, you did?
I did both because it's so impressive. So Lara is president of worldwide field operations at Samsara, which just last quarter posted 40% year-on-year growth, achieving $930 million in ARR. Congratulations. And they did that in just over 6 years, and they achieved their first adjusted free cash flow positive quarter, which in today's markets are super important. So congratulations.
Yay, Samsara.
Way to go. But not only that, she also had a very impressive career at another amazing company, ServiceNow, where she reported to Bill McDermott, as well as the prior CEO, and again, ran a ton of the different customer-facing operations, customer services, professional services, customer experience, alliance and channels, ecosystems, and training and certification organization. So I get tired saying all those. You probably got a little overwhelmed writing them all. But she established her career at Bain, and she advised companies around the world on strategy, M&A, and operational efficiency. And if that isn't enough, she's also a board member on Confluent. So a ton of experience with some of the best companies in tech. So thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, and nice to see all of you.
All right. So we're going to deliver on the promise that Alex made. I have some questions here. I love having I feel like I'm on a talk show host. I have some questions, but really the important thing is for you to develop your own questions as we're talking. And Laura's, she's great. So she's going to help us out sharing some of the stories. And I want to start with just level setting for the crowd, because obviously we all know the names, Samsara and ServiceNow and Confluent. But can you touch briefly on these companies and a little bit about the size, the scale, just to help people understand?
I do all these companies do, yes. So I'll start with the current one, Samsara. So I've only been there, actually, this is like less than 6 months, so I'm still pretty new. Samsara is trying to redefine the physical operations world. So it's taking, IoT data and thinking about, the operations buyer and how do you bring all that data into a single platform for them to manage their business and drive digital transformation in a industry where, across industries, frankly, where I would say it feels 10 years behind where IT is. So it's a super interesting and very different to sell to operations buyers than to IT buyers, kind of refreshing. But Samsara is doing really well. It'll hit $1 billion this year, growing north of 40%. And so that's where I am now. Previously, I was at ServiceNow. So those of you who haven't heard of ServiceNow, it is going to hit $8 billion of $8.5 billion probably this year in revenue, over 20,000 employees. And basically, it drives workflow automation. It started with IT service management, and then it goes into broader workflow automation across the front office and back office. And then Confluent is basically the commercialized Kafka. So data streaming. I joined the board about 6 months before they went public. They went public about 2.5 years ago. Samsara, by the way, went public almost 2 years ago, so sort of similar. A little bit smaller, a little bit slower growth than Samsara. It's, $750 or something in revenue and growing kind of in the mid-30s. So that is, what those companies are, different phases and very, very different kind of business models, but all great software companies.
Yeah, it's an amazing set. And one of the reasons that I think it's so wonderful to have Lara here is both with your combined consulting background, but working at this breadth of different types of companies. One of the things that I know, just because I've had the pleasure of hearing you speak a few times, is you have a really wonderful way of making sense out of a lot of different patterns. And you talk about this concept of a journey framework. And what I'd love is for you to share with the audience, what is the journey framework that you've really assembled from all these different experiences to frame up how, regardless of what company you're at, how you can think about its growth through the phases?
Yeah, well, I mean, I will not actually take credit for this because I stole it from Frank Slootman, who is also at a great software company at Snowflake and was previously at ServiceNow. But he originally talked about software companies like this, and I found it to be actually very useful, and I'm bringing it to Samsara now. So there's kind of multiple phases, and the first phase is kind of $0 to $100 million of revenue, where you're like trying to find product market fit, looking for the lightning in the bottle. That's the phase in which many of your companies, I believe, are in. That sort of early stage. That is the stage where actually I have not worked at a company or advised a company in that phase. That's the early, like, hard, startup-y phase of a company. Then you go into kind of phase 2, which is, you found product market fit, you've hit $100 million revenue, and you're scaling to $1 billion, and that is where you are scaling the hell out of it. You are building out your capacity in your field. You are continuing to refine your product, and you're growing as just as much as possible. And that's the phase that like Confluent's still in, and Samsara is sort of closing that phase. And then phase 3 is where you go from $1 billion company to kind of a multi-billion dollar company. That's where I started at ServiceNow. That's obviously why I came to Samsara, et cetera. That's a super interesting phase because you go from often one product to multi-products. You're expanding geographically. You're often, you're 100 times the scale of the original systems and processes that you grew. So you're rebuilding a bunch of that stuff because it all is breaking. And there's a lot of exciting foundational changes that are made during that time. You're also thinking about you're getting to the point where your recurring revenue, where your existing customers are a pretty big part of your revenue, and so you're really thinking about how do we continue to refine customer success so we can expand and make sure we keep those companies or those customers happy, et cetera, and thinking about that full customer journey. And then the kind of multi-billion, $3 billion, whatever, to 5, 7, 10. That's where I was for most of my time at ServiceNow. And that's a super interesting one, but more complicated. It's where the ecosystem becomes really, really important. And you're trying to figure out how do other people make money for me, and how do I build out those really strong partnerships that have real commercial benefit. You're thinking about moving up and often selling to, into the C-suite versus to whoever your economic buyer originally was. I think there's a lot of interesting stories about Salesforce actually figuring this out, which is like selling to the head of sales is one thing, but when you can actually start to sell to the CEO and solve real, CEO or board level business issues, you end up with much bigger deals and much bigger conversations. And that's a journey that I watched Bill McDermott, navigate beautifully at ServiceNow, and where ServiceNow has really evolved. That's a hard thing to do, but it's a super interesting part of the journey. So there's lots and lots of lessons kind of within each one. But I do think they are, the phases work well because they are distinctly different, and it does feel like a different chapter for a company. They feel like massive numbers, until you reach them, and then you realize, if you can continue to drive growth at scale, that's the beauty of like how quickly this stuff compounds, especially when you have a recurring revenue model.
Yeah, I love that. And one of the things that strikes me as I hear you talk through the different phases is that talent is probably a little bit different in those different phases, and processes are different. And you kind of slipped it in there, but you're going to have to rip stuff down to rebuild for what you need now. And I think it's really important, and it's part of why I think a lot of quote big company people crash and burn in startups, is because they try to take stuff from phase 3 or 4 into phase 1, and you guys are laughing because that doesn't work. But it's if you can appreciate what phase you're in, and the beauty and the power and the strength and the flexibility of where you're at, but also start to see those transitions and know that different things are needed, that's your opportunity as a leader to scale through the phases, or find your favorite one and just rinse and repeat and get better and better.
Yeah.
And that's my segue into, you've actually seen different companies at different parts of the phases. Can you share one or two examples from your own experience on what teams either got, really, really right or really, really wrong as they were kind of navigating through and scaling the business?
Yeah, I mean, so a couple different examples maybe. I would say like the early examples that I have, and well, one is what you just talked about, which is like as you think about kind of going into different phases, what do you need to think about differently? And I think it's really important to have the multi-year vision of like where we're going, like what does the next phase look like, and therefore what seeds do you need to plant over that period now. And so, a lot of companies will maybe start with like a PLG motion, but they end up having to do a top-down selling motion to add as they move up market. Or Samsara's case that started very much mid-market, classic mid-market selling, and now moving to sort of a much more classic enterprise sales motion. And that's just very different. You can try to stretch your motion up, but when you really look at it, they're actually quite different, and you need different skill sets, you need different processes, you need different comp models, you need different leadership, you need different roles and responsibilities, pre-sales through post-sales across that. And so just understanding when that transition is and when you want to start investing in that talent and the supporting systems around it is super important. And so right now, that's one of the things that I'm doing at Samsara. Like over time, you need the product to come around because you need it to have the right security and the right scalability and the right supportability to actually sell to the enterprise. And so it's important to have that journey and build that into your product. But once you're able to do that, like then you do need to invest in different talent. And so I'm finding like needing to do a whole kind of enterprise plus redesign, which is looking at roles and responsibilities. It's looking at coverage models. It's looking at leadership talent, et cetera, which is a pretty big transition. But when you kind of, if you build out the shape of the business, like what is this business going to look like in 3 to 5 years, and how's the mix going to differ across geographies? How's it going to differ across segments? How's it going to differ across products? You can kind of see like, oh wow, if I work backwards from that success, there's foundational things that I have to build. And so that's a really good example, I think, of like a way that I would recommend that you approach it, because what got you to a lot of the foundational things that got you to where you are going to continue, but there's things that won't continue to work as you scale.
Yeah, I love that. And to me, a few of the nuggets in what you just said, one is thinking about that journey. And what one of the folks I used to work for had done, he kept an org chart for what he thought the organization would look like 3 years in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason he did that was twofold. One, so he could figure out who in his current organization would be able to evolve into those different roles, but also what new things he'd have to fill out. And then, and this gentleman's a complete extrovert and a really close friend of mine, but he also built the network for the jobs he knew he was going to have to hire 18, 24 months out.
Yeah.
And I think particularly when I think about some of the growth I've seen in the companies that you've worked at and in my own experience, when are you going to have a professional services group, or, customer support's going to go to that next level. It's not going to be reactive, it's going to be proactive, or, your education and certification. And so I think you're right. Like if you know where you are on that journey, and as a leader, you're looking in the future, then you can figure out what the game plan is, and you're not just always tactically responding. Yeah, there's a question. Of course.
Sure.
This is your day. It's your day.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to paint the vision for where you're going, right? I mean, it's like it's this is great. This is where we are. This is the vision of the company that we want to be, and here's why. Like here's the types of deals we want to do. Here's our aspiration and our purpose, and where we want to get to and the impact that we want to have, and that means we need to be doing this kind of thing. And we will continue to do that, but we need to also do this over time and evolve in this way, and like being able to paint that broader vision that I think aligns with sort of an optimistic view of like what kind of company you want to be, but also like for me, like tying it to this broader purpose of like that is bolder than where you are and like sets a, sets a super optimistic and ambitious goal, I think is like incredibly important. That's actually one of the lessons that I learned from we talked about this a little bit, like working for different CEOs, you learn a lot of lessons. Like my Bill McDermott lesson is, um, he's like, for those of you who've ever met him or like heard him speak, he's like the most optimistic person you've ever met in your entire life. And so he's like not just like glass half full. He's like, the glass is half full and it's so much bigger than you ever imagined the glass to be. And as a consultant, I was very much like, oh, like we build the bottoms up model and we look at reasonable growth rates and we just like, this is kind of the path and this is what's reasonable. He's like, that's, it's gonna be like this, and there's the lesson I took from it is it actually, everybody raised their game. Everybody thought bigger and thought about a bigger outcome than you would have normally built, just looking at where you are today and the incremental changes from that. And there's a huge amount of power in doing that. And so I would think about that lesson as it relates to your question.
Yeah, I say I'd add on to that. I completely agree with that. And I would say when I reflect back on the CEOs that I worked for, and I've worked for some amazing CEOs, including Lou Cerny and Paul Moritz at VMware, amongst others, it's that undeniable belief that you're going to make the world an amazing place, like beyond, and it like it almost brings you back to being like a little kid where like no is not in your vocabulary. It's just how, why, all these things. So I think that's really powerful. One thing I found working for Lou at New Relic, because Lou was like, Bill, big vision, going to conquer the world. This is pre-IPO. We ended up taking the company public and then Lou's out selling this incredible vision. And the team is like, well, holy crap, like that's not what the product does. And I think to your point, like, I got to make my number. And we actually went through a structured exercise where we explained at an all hands to the company, like Lou's job is to create the future. And he's speaking to investors and he's speaking to CEOs and the possibilities. Hillary's job as the head of sales and the president is to set the strategic roadmap with her customers on what they're going to buy in the next 18 to 24 months. Your job is to make the quarterly number. And you have to align like what's on the truck for each of those phases. And when you're crossing over, what I've found to be most effective is two things. One, you have your special forces that go in. So you say, hey, every piece of that's really important. And what we're going to do as we're crossing this chasm to this bigger thing is we're going to put the special forces team here to go out and pave the path while you guys are doing what we've always been doing. And then as this matures, you're going to move into that. Mm-hmm. The second thing is you equally, if not disproportionately, overvalue the people who are ringing the register today. And this is true on the product side and the go-to-market side, because oftentimes you get stuck on the shiny new toy, and that's all the CEO ever wants to talk about. You need to make sure that the people who are running the business every day are recognized for what they're doing. But I think what Laura says, it's so important. They have to understand this is where you're all going, and this is why it's so great. And these are the people who are going to help pave the road to get here. And I'm doing this to pay the bills, to pave the road to next be there. And then we're going to go the next phase up the mountain.
Yeah, that's great.
That was a great question. Yeah, I mean, I can throw something out, and if you have something as well. And I sit on a lot of boards, so I'm the person you're trying to make happy. And what I would say is, what I find super effective is nobody has a crystal ball right now, and the markets are changing and shifting, and who knows whether we're going to have a hard landing or whatever, and then China and everything. So what I find really helpful is looking at scenarios. And so if I were in your seat, what I would say is, okay, here's what I think is the realistic, aggressive plan. Here is what it could look like if everything fell apart, and here's what it could look like if everything was amazing. And I'd figure out in each of those worlds, what would I do? And I'd say, okay, across all of them, these are clearly the no regret moves. So we're absolutely going to do that. And then I'd figure out what are the leading indicators that help me understand what my true path is. And then as I see those leading indicators, where am I investing? And so what I would do is I'd say, like, hey, Vaughn, I know everybody wants to grow faster, but I want to be cognizant and not get us in a bad situation. So I can see 3 potential ways forward. Here are the steps I'm taking right now. Here are the leading indicators I'm looking at. And as soon as we see the pipeline get to this or the multiples get to that, I've been out proactively networking, so I can bring people on quickly. But the last thing I want to do is bring people on and not be able to feed them, because that will ruin our reputation. That will do this, this, and this. But I think if you do that, you help ground the board and the CEO in reality. Of course, everybody wants that, but you can't guarantee it. So how am I taking control of uncertainty through having a playbook to navigate through that? Do you have other thoughts?
No, I think it's a great answer and a wise one. Yeah.
Now, Lara, customer experience. This is my favorite story. You guys are in for a treat. So when I was doing some research, even though I've known Lara for a long time, I decided, because there's so much stuff on the internet, to see what has she said at previous panels.
This is like the internet lives forever.
I know. She was like, how did you know this? So she has an amazing story about her mother's experience with Chewy. And you've always talked about customer experience. And I think that's one of the things that's made you such a great leader. Because when you talk about things like sustainability and all of that, if you start with the customer in mind, and if you start with focusing on customer value and developing, like what Joe said, like trust with your customers and how you develop trust, I thought the Chewy story was so perfect. And I was hoping you could share that with this audience and talk about the role of customer experience in kind of that last mile.
Yeah, so at ServiceNow, I owned everything post-sales and the partners, as I shared in my resume summary. And one of the things that I felt was really going to make a difference for the company was to truly build a customer-centric culture in a way that's not just like the words on the slide that you have, but like really means something to people. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about what that really meant and what that meant in enterprise software, because you think about, like, when you think about great customer experience, you think about consumer brands. And so this, as you think about it and you ask people, like, what brands really resonate with them, they tend to be consumer brands. And it tends to be like these incredibly emotional experiences where you, like, either deeply did something to really piss them off and they hate you and they're going to tell your friends about it, or you did something to delight them in a moment where it really mattered. And so, like, my example of that was Chewy, which is a pet products company. You've probably heard of them. Some of you might be customers. And it was like during the pandemic, I wasn't able to see my parents. My parents, all 5 of their children are adults and left the house. And so my mother's new child is her dog. And so, like, I'm always hearing about the dog, and the dog is getting, like, really old. Dudley was his name. And Dudley dies during the pandemic, which was very sad. And so she had to cancel Dudley's medication for Chewy. My mom was, like, super devastated. And Chewy sent her flowers, like, to her home. And that is, like, just what they do when they recognize that life event with their customer. And it was unbelievably meaningful for a pet parent. And it was one of those things that, like, she will be a customer for life. And as a result, that's where I buy my dog stuff and, like, whatever, like, my whole family probably. And then you kind of look at this, and actually, if you Google it, like, that's like a thing they do that has driven, like, a tremendous amount of loyalty. And when you think about the other examples of, like, which companies really get this right, they do tend to be, consumer companies. And you realize that it's not just about, like, one great customer, service rep or something. It is a culture that they have, like, deeply embedded across everything that they do, and it's across the whole company. And so the idea was, and I think is, and the lesson that I took away from it is, like, when you think about building, a customer-centric culture. It really has to be a cultural movement that is owned from the top, but also owned by every single function. And so I often think about it as like, if you, and it's about, delighting your customers. And so for me, it was about like, how do you create a frictionless experience, where you're making it really, really easy to do business with your customer? How do you make it a valuable experience and that they're actually getting real business for enterprise software, real business value about it? And how do you make it delightful? Like, how do you actually make it a delightful experience? And if you think about kind of all of those dimensions, there's ways that every function can kind of play into that, right? Like, if you are in facilities and a customer is coming to your offices, like, what is it? Like, car companies are amazing at this. Like, there's a smell for every different car, and like the sound that your car makes when the door closes is like a deeply thought through thing. It's like every experience of what your office feels like, what kind of water you're serving, what the coffee is, like whatever it is, to like legal. Like, the challenge I would put out there is like, how do you create a frictionless or even a delightful process with legal? Like, can you imagine a one-click, MSA? Like, how delightful would that be? And so it's like a challenge to every single person to like really think outside in about how they interact with the customer, and what their processes look like, and putting a framework that's driven by what we all understand in our real lives around what we've experienced and recognized as these amazing, loyalty creating moments. But because we know customer loyalty is correlated with all of the good things for our companies, like that data has been proven over and over again. And so it was just a way to create a narrative and a framework that inspired the company to kind of move to that.
I love that story. And I'm also a pet owner, and I've got 3 kids, and one's out of the house and 2 are going. And my kids are like, "You're replacing us with pets and with plants." Like, they're my new babies. They won't leave me. The thing that I think is really valuable, well, there's a lot of valuable things in what you said, but what I love when you interweave customer experience throughout all those different functions, um, the other beautiful thing that happens is your employees become so much more engaged because they actually feel that they're in service to somebody. And I remember reading this amazing article about an accounting firm, like one of the big, I guess there's only 4 now or 3, whatever it is. I mean, that's an awful job, and I apologize to any accountants, but you're all salespeople, so you clearly don't do accounting. But what they did is they actually put poster boards up on what some of their clients did for jobs, and like how, what they were in service to, and their employee satisfaction went through the roof. And Alex knows Katie Abbott, but she was our general counsel at Puppet, and this field loved her. Like, what field loves their general counsel? And the clients loved her. And the harder the client, like AXA, like, oh my gosh, they were so challenging. But she knew French, and she'd get on there, and she'd create a human connection. And then she'd be like, oh, okay, let's just talk about the business objective you have before you can tell this legalese. And she just had a way of making people feel good. Yeah. And I think, to your point, if you can help people rise up out of the just like, I got to get this and I got to check these metrics, to like, oh, we're in service to something bigger and greater. And as like Joe was talking about, we're doing it as a team. Like, that's really cool.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of another lesson from one of my many bosses, and I actually see it in a bunch of different ways. So one of the things that John Donahoe did, he was the CEO of ServiceNow, he's now the CEO of Nike, and he's the one that hired me into ServiceNow, was like this. How do you like this company needs purpose? Like, it needs a purpose statement. It needs a higher reason.
Yeah.
And it was like IT service management. Like, who gives a shit, And so it ended up like going back to a founder story, right? Which was, Fred Luddy, who was the founder of ServiceNow, he was, and this is where like telling the origin story that like, and tying it to a greater purpose is like so incredibly powerful. Fred Luddy was like basically working with this woman. Her name was Phyllis. I still remember it because stories are so powerful. And, he was like an intern or something. He was like a kid. And Phyllis had to do this like shitty, repetitive, like manual thing every single day. And her job was tedious and boring and awful. And so Fred, like being the coding kid or whatever, like was like, oh, I'm going to write a script for Phyllis. And Phyllis, like, he's like, hey, Phyllis, I worked all night and I did this for you. And like, all you have to do now, instead of doing all these 15 steps, is like, plug in this one number and press click and it's done. And he did this for Phyllis, and Phyllis cried. And he said, I want to build something that makes the work easier for people. And so, John took that nugget of a story, of an origin story, and created this bigger purpose. And it's like, ServiceNow makes the world of work better for people. And it became this like incredible like culture and purpose sort of framing that everyone rose to and said, like, our jobs are noble. Like, we're not automating away jobs. We're like actually making people's lives better and making the world of work better. And we're helping all the Phyllises of the world, and helping people do the things that only people can and should do, and not have to do that menial, boring, brain dead, like mind numbing, I hate my job sort of tasks, and that became like this incredibly powerful motivator for everyone. And so it was like you had the purpose, and then you had like the focus on the customer, and it all laddered up in this beautiful way. And I see the same thing at Samsara, and it starts with this founding vision of like, I want to solve a problem that like matters to the world. And in physical operations, they're still on pen and paper. There's tons of accidents on our roads. Like a huge amount of our emissions problems in the world have to do with this physical stuff that's created and moved around. Which is 40% of our GDP. And how do we create a more sustainable world? And how do we create a safer world? And how do we also help make these companies more efficient? And so, again, at Samsara, it's this founding idea laddered to a bigger purpose, and then the focus on the customer sort of helps drive those big purpose goals that like I care about. I care about leading a company that's going to have an impact, and I think like many of our employees, and I think increasingly our younger employees, care really deeply about something that ladders to a higher purpose. And so just what you were talking about, I think is just a worthy lesson to think about, like, do you have that laddering principle in your company, and how do you build it and really drive and motivate people and drive momentum around that?
Yeah, I love that. And as I hear you talk about that, and having been a CEO, like all of you should expect from your CEOs, and probably because you're working at startups, like you believe in the vision that they've created, that they've started, and that they're doing. But oftentimes, the go-to-market leaders are the better storytellers. And so you might have an opportunity to actually partner with them to build out some of these generational stories. The fact that you still know the story of ServiceNow, like I'm just like, wow, like I'm not going to forget that. I'm not going to forget Chewy. So I think that's an opportunity you have really to be a leader of the company, not just the leader of the go-to-market, to create that compelling story. And the one thing I'll add on to that is when you're in service to your customers, it's really around how are you connecting your story to theirs? And so how is your mission actually helping them achieve the mission in their company? But one of the most important things that I've also learned in my career is how is your solution going to help that person on their personal mission? Whether that be a promotion, whether that be learning something new, pushing new boundaries. And so this whole focus on customer, I think, is powerful at so many different levels, as you say. And you all sit in the seat that can have the biggest influence given your skill set and what you're responsible for. So now kind of double clicking on that a little bit to do something as amazing as what Chewy did for your mother, and to get it right, because you wouldn't want to get that wrong. It does require what Alex mentioned at the beginning, like this integration of people, process, technology. Can you talk a little bit about the role of process design and technology in great execution? Because I know you're wrestling through some of that in your current job.
Yeah, I mean, it's super important. Like, you can get a long way with the heroics of a few individuals, and good storytelling, and people being able to swivel chair their way by knowing everybody and how to get stuff done. And it just doesn't scale, right? Like it eventually breaks, and as you grow at the rates that you are all talking about growing, like you really do need to think through the process, the technology to be able to enable these things to scale. And I think foundationally, they do start with they do start with culture, right? But I think you have to be intentional about those things over time, and recognize the first version of what you build probably will need to be rebuilt over time. But it is a system to create outcomes like that, and so I would just say don't underestimate the amount of work that you will have to put into doing that, and also thinking about like how cross-functional oftentimes those systems and those processes need to be.
And this isn't on my cards, and don't kill me, but when you're working on that, and again thinking about earlier stage companies, like there's I was a big company kid when I went to New Relic, and I used to think like everybody there was so stupid because they put all these stupid terms in their contracts, and their systems were a mess. And I was like, oh my God, like, are you idiots? And then like you realize, and I ran a $5 million company, and I'm like, of course you're going to agree to those terms. Like you have to survive.
Right.
And so you've seen a lot of companies kind of go through the growth, like how do you know when you need to invest more in systems, or you need to start over, or who do you need to partner with to figure that out? Like how do you I find I used to be a CIO. I find systems and technology so hard to get right. Like any
I mean, I don't know that I have all the answers to this. I know that this is one of the things that like right now, I mean, at a company that's doing incredibly well and trading at a one of the top 10 multiples in tech, and it's like we got to redo our systems, and and it just like it just happens. And so like um one of the first and most important hire that I made was a very tenured SVP of sales ops who knew process and who knew systems well. And like his most important thing is, and we're actually like phrasing it as seller experience, but really it's customer experience. But because the sellers are so frustrated by how difficult the processes are, we're branding it. And like it's going to be a multi-year journey, but having somebody there who's like focused on it, who knows that how to do it, how to fix it, is super important. And like my approach to it, for what it's worth, and I'll probably come back in a year and tell you all the reasons I was wrong with this, but I'm actually starting with like a journey map and like laying out, because I find if you don't scope it right, you're going to scope it too narrow, or you're going to just like band-aid it. We're actually starting with a full end-to-end journey map, and we're doing the seller version of it and we're doing the customer version of it. Turns out the pain points are exactly the same for both, but like, and then taking that down into, okay, well, what are the root causes for it? And like, do we need to completely re-architect Salesforce? Like what's going on with our Salesforce and NetSuite integration? And why is it creating all these broken things? What do we need to fix? Like all these ridiculous things, you have to take it down to the studs, and it's really hard to like redo it. And the reality is for some of those like big systems things, it's going to take 2 years to like completely, continue to fly the plane at a high altitude at a, increasing pace and redo that. But in the interim, like what are the things that we can do that create quick wins and let us like alleviate some of that pain? And it might be a little bit more manual, or it might be a little bit exception based in the meantime, but making sure you continue to like I hear you, I understand the full scope of this problem, and here's the end state, and here's how long it's going to take us, but along the way, here's the ways we're going to make this better for you. Like that's how I'm thinking about it right now.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of the journey map. I'm going to date myself, but there is a great Harvard Business Review article, and I think it's from like 1980. I don't know, maybe 1990, but it's called "Staple Yourself to an Order," and it does exactly what you just described. But it talks about, from a customer perspective, like what are, if you're on that order, like they just bought something, how many different departments and handoffs and things that happen. And one of the things that you uncover when you work at companies of different sizes and scale, you realize in smaller companies, the handoffs are somewhat seamless because they're all people to people, and it's relationship based, and it's so efficient and so small that it works really well. But to your point, particularly if you have hypergrowth, like these things start to crack pretty quickly, and all of a sudden, customers talking to 6 different people to try to solve one problem. It's super inefficient. When I was at New Relic, we had this problem, and I remember Hillary coming in, and I was CIO and she was running all of go-to-market. And she's like, this is just wrong. She's like, from the time a customer indicates on our website that they're interested in learning more about our product to the time that somebody's actually getting back to them, it can be as long as 2 days. She goes, we are losing money left and right because somebody's like on their lunch break, they're clicking on it, they don't get a response in less than 2 minutes. They're gone. They're on to App D, they're somewhere else. And it's like, you need to fix this. And I'm looking at it, I'm like, okay, I've got, Marketo, I've got some archaic version of Salesforce. I have different definitions of customers. I don't have common hierarchies. And it took a while to solve. But what you said that I think is so important as you're scaling is figure out who you solve for first. And so what we were able to do was to set up literally people in swivel chairs who, we'd get this file and we could, very quickly, if they were in our database, tell if they were super important or we didn't know or we knew that they weren't. And then we could have people solve the system problem until the system could get fixed. Yeah. But it's so amazing how it goes from working to not working. And then you really have to figure out those most important breakpoints. Any questions from the audience? I have some more questions here, but yes.
I think culture is one of those things that you're going to have a culture one way or another. It's either going to be the culture you want or a culture that you don't want. And so you have to be super purposeful and super explicit about culture. And I think there's a whole exercise around like defining what you think your cultural values are. What are they? Like eyes wide open. What are they? And what are the things we want to keep and what are the things we need to evolve as so like being explicit about it and going through that exercise is important. But once you define it, it's like any change management, right? Like you actually have to make it real in people's lives by telling stories around it, by celebrating it, by starting your meetings, sort of talking about like how these things fit into, different culture, like telling examples of like, by the way, this is a great example of working backwards from winning or teamwork or whatever your things are, so I think you can't underestimate the amount that you have to reinforce it as a leader, and you have to celebrate it and you have to tell stories about it, but you have to be explicit about it, and so that's my learning on this is like it's any kind of change management 101 like challenge.
Yeah, one of the best exercises I ever had to do, I had the luxury of having John Chambers from Cisco on the board of one of the startups I ran. And we were talking about culture. He said, okay, Yvonne, he goes, you think you have such a good culture? I want you to go into work tomorrow with your executive team and have them write down on a sheet of paper the 2 to 3 words that they feel describe your culture. And he goes, if more than half of them are the same words, you win. He goes, do you think I'm going to win? I'm like, no, you're not. You're going to win, John. Like, I got to get on this. But it's actually a really simple and good exercise to do that with your team. It's a little intimidating because as soon as you say it, they're not going to write down the same words. But go through the exercise and then see, what do people think describes the culture? What of that do you want to keep? What of that do you want to shed? And how do you as a leadership team commit to that? And then they can do it with their teams and so forth. So I think that's really powerful. The other thing, Laura mentioned, talking about the successes and, who you hire and all these things. Who you fire is one of the most important things about culture. And we all say that, and we all know that, and we are too slow to do it. And I'm working with a CEO right now, and it's not Alex, so nobody on his team, be worried. But I'm working with a CEO right now who has a lot going on, and they're already recruiting for one of the folks on their executive team, and and they have another executive who's kind of doing okay, struggling a little bit. And then she said the deadly words, like, he's bringing the team down. Like, he's not treating people with respect. And I'm like, you've got to get rid of him. And the most fascinating thing is when I talked to her 3 weeks later, she's like, yeah, one of my VPs pulled me aside and they're wondering why I haven't done something. And I'm like, I'm wondering why you haven't done something. And they had like all these reasons, like, well, I got this, I got to do this, I got to do this, I got to do this. Like, it is so important because the higher you get, the more people watch what you do. And when you let somebody slide by, particularly on cultural values around respect, trust, accountability, and all of that, it doesn't matter whether they're bringing in the sales deal, it's how they do it. And so I just would say that's probably the biggest thing in setting culture or breaking culture.
Yeah.
I mean, I can share one. When I first went to New Relic was about 100 million in revenue, on the path to going public. And we were going through the transition of what I would call developer love. Like, people would try the product, fall in love, call, subscribe, everything was great, to needing to sell higher in the enterprise. And we hired a handful of folks who were great sales reps, because I used to be at VMware. We hired a handful of folks from VMware who were awesome, and they all crashed and burned. And the reason that they crashed and burned is that they were used to having a calling card. Like, everybody knew VMware. So they could call up and be like, hey, I'd like to get, 30 minutes of your time. I'm from VMware. They'd be like, okay. Like, even though New Relic was a darling in Silicon Valley at that time, like, it wasn't a calling card. And so they didn't have the calling card. They couldn't turn to the marketing department and have like the materials that they needed. They didn't have a mature professional services organization. And it was really sad because these were people I knew who'd been, overachievers. And it really highlighted to me the importance of recognizing, to Laura's, and this is why I like the journey framework, where are you at on that journey? And what skill sets do you need? And hiring people who love to do that type of work. So if you're starting out, you need people who are super scrappy, who are going to break down doors and all that. When you get to that middle section, you need people who, are scrappy enough that they can break in, but they're polished enough that they can have repeatable use cases and drive velocity. When you get to be even bigger, you can't have renegades out there promising stuff you can't deliver, doing that. So you have to kind of like manage that process. And I've worked with amazing sales leaders and sales reps who are great at different phases. Some will go phase to phase to phase, but a lot of them know their sweet spot and they just want to get really big checks. So just where I've seen people go the most wrong is like they hire ahead of the phase that they're in.
Yeah. I think that's a good one. Another one that I would just say is the go-to-market model that you need, pre-sales and post-sales, is very unique to your customers and your product and how difficult your product is or easy your product is, like what it needs. And so, like, assuming that there's a certain model and that's what you need to scale towards, is really dangerous. So, like, for example, like ServiceNow ended up building out an incredibly expensive sales model because they assumed that you needed, you had an AE and then you had, SEs, and then you had a specialist who also needed their own technical SE, like for every single product. And it ends up like, as you're looking at like adding your core AE, the multiplier on how you scale that to continue to grow your business is insanely expensive if you don't challenge the underlying assumptions of like, why do I need all these people? Like, does this product really require this? Is this enough of a different buyer? Is this technically difficult enough? Like, why can't these existing resources carry that? And so I think you have to like sometimes go back and like just challenge your coverage model assumptions. Like when I came into Samsara, there was a coverage model assumption post sales that was just like not going to scale as the sort of existing business scaled. And it was like, why are we doing this? Like, why are we spending all of this money? Like, what is going on that the rep can't own the responsibility for the customer success more, and like, what are we doing wrong in our whole systems in terms of our accountabilities and our comp, et cetera? Like, why are we building this incredibly expensive machine? And so sometimes it's like going back to first principles and just challenging the assumptions that maybe somebody started with a certain coverage model for a certain product or a certain phase, and then stepping back and saying like, okay, well, how's this going to scale, and what's this going to cost us in like 2 years, 3 years, whatever, and like, do we really need that? Is that the highest and best use of our resources? So I think you have to continually challenge those assumptions and sort of fast forward it to see like, how will that model scale or not scale?
Yeah, I want to second, third, fourth that, because it's amazing. I have seen so many companies waste a ton of money. And if you break it down to like simple metrics, an easy way you can see how you're trending on that is, what is your, revenue or ARR per rep? And then what is it per, go-to-market headcount? And what becomes really interesting is, I worked at Accenture for a long time and did a lot of this analysis for companies, but I worked for one company where they were losing money on every sale by the time they paid the channel partner and the overlay and this and that. And it happens exactly as Lara said. At one point in time, the coverage model and the comp made sense, but then they added more and more and more, and things changed, and they never took anything away. They never took that fresh look.
Yeah, and budgeting every year was just multiplying the dollars times the coverage model, and that's just what happened. Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess my very recent experience is coming over to Samsara. I think like you have to come in a little bit humble at first, and Hillary actually gave me good advice. So we know this, like it's like these circles are very small.
Yeah.
I remember talking to Hillary before I started my job, and she said one of the pieces of advice she gave me was write down your answer first, like your week one assumptions of like what you think needs to change. She's like, just write it down, and then like set it aside and just listen. She's like, but make sure you write it down, because like it's going to be really important to listen and not come in too hot or make too many assumptions and make a bunch of mistakes. And you also have to build trust with these people, right? But over time, but like go back to that first list, because 80% of what you write down will actually be right, and people will talk you out of it by telling you the reasons why it has to be this way or whatever, and like and refer back to that. And I think that process is it's adjacent to what you're saying, but I think it gets at the same thing, which is like, I think it is really important to have a sense of like, based on my experience, based on my pattern recognition, based on my view of where we need to be in 3 years or whatever, these are the things that I think we will really need to evolve to. That being said, I need to understand why these people are successful, why they love this place, what they're frustrated with, what they deeply believe, in order to understand what are the things that like are central and core and foundational and worth celebrating, and then what are the things that I'm going to have to teach people over time to shift to. And I think one of the failure modes for like new leaders when they come in is coming in and like kind of like pouring cold water on everything and just like not honoring what got you to where you are, and not honoring the leaders before you, and like, because people have relationships, there's really good reasons why a company did the things they did, and sort of respecting it and honoring it, and noting that, and then also saying, and these are the ways we're going to have to evolve. So that's my point of view on it.
Yeah, I love that. And I can give you an example from New Relic. Louis Cerny, the CEO, when he founded New Relic, it was really important. His prior company, they ended up selling to CA. Like he realized it was wily and it wasn't economical. Like it required too much professional services to actually get anything meaningful out of it. So when he created New Relic, he's like, I'm going to make the software so intuitive, you never need services. Like services, that was a bad word. And so Hillary comes in and she's supposed to sell to the enterprise and do all this. And she's like, we need a services organization. The software like will solve its own problem. And it's so intuitive. They don't need training. They don't need services. And what was really important was understanding from Lou's perspective, the reason he didn't want a product that needs services is he thought life was too short for crappy software. And he had spent time at Apple, and he wanted beautiful experiences, and he wanted customer delight. And so what became important is what Laura says, like understanding why something is the way it is. Why is a belief so deeply held? And then what we did is we said, okay, well, delighting these customers is they don't want services because they think the technology is so hard to use. Like I talked to one of my friends who was a CIO. He's like, the reason I want software is you guys are professional services, is you all are experts in your software. I don't want my team wasting time trying to figure out what you already know. I want to accelerate the joy and wonder and value they get from it. And so by being able to explain to Lou that we understood why it was so important to have beautiful software that delighted customers, and that services could be part of that if done in the right way, got us the evolution that we needed. But I think it starts with what Laura said. It's like really listening and understanding and honoring very deeply why things are the way they are, and then understanding how everything has to evolve and change. That's just life. But putting it in the right context that people can hear it and embrace it.
I guess I would partner with your executive team, and like you should the board should be mandating that like what is our narrative and what is our story here, and you're going to have to educate the company on it and educate the go-to-market team on it, because you will need to know that narrative. And so I actually think like a shift like that, like Gen AI, that's so foundational, is going to change so much in the world. Like it should be a conversation in every single boardroom, and on how is this going to impact your company? How are you going to evolve? What are you going to do about it? And it's something that, your employees want to know, right? Your customers want to know. Like everyone wants to know the narrative, and so you need to force that, like the leadership, to be able to like have the vision and at least paint some version of the journey, even if you don't know it exactly, because like it just can't be an unanswered question, because people will then question your viability as a company.
Yeah, I'd say one of the things that I learned when I was a CIO, one of my good friends told me, he said, here's how CIOs buy. The number one thing is the popularity contest. Like, are other people buying this? Is it a public company? Am I going to get fired if it fails? Like, that's number one. The second is, does their roadmap align with mine? And so most CIOs of larger enterprises don't want to be swapping out tools every 6 months, every 12 months, every 24 months. Like they want to have people who are going to evolve in the direction that they want to evolve. And the third thing is do they solve a problem I have today at a good ROI? But if you think about that from the Gen AI question, and Laura and I talked about Gen AI before, and she's like, all right, well, whatever. It's not real today. But it's not. In most large enterprises, it's not. It will be. It'll have impact in different pockets. But I think it goes back to that, 5-year CEO vision. You have to have a vision that incorporates it. We all know it's here and it's going to change how we do things. And then as a go-to-market leader, you have to have, that, 2-year, like here's how you're going to see it start to shape and evolve and make what we're giving you more powerful. I think the teams that are going to win long-term are the ones who have those two things and they're honest about what they have today. Because there's way too many people out there today promising value in products that are not at the level of maturity, security, scalability. And you are going to win a sale today that will churn and lose trust. And so as go-to-market leaders, what I would say is do what Laura said. Push your board and executive team to have that 5-year vision. You need to have a coherent 18 to 24-month story that ties into that bridges to what's on the truck today. Arm your teams with that, but make sure that they are being transparent, because they will earn more trust if they say, hey, this is where we're going, and that sounds like it aligns with where you're trying to get to, and here's where we are today, and here's what I'd love to do, go into beta with you so we can prove this out together. But the people who get ahead of themselves are going to fall flat.
Yeah.
The couple things that come top to mind, first off, I hate surprises. hate surprises. I don't even like surprise birthday parties. Like, I just don't like surprises. And I really don't like bad surprises. And the closer you get to being a public company, and once you're a public company, like, bad surprises are really, really bad. So, have a hard conversation early, and invite people in to help you solve the problems, because then it's your problems, not you're going to get fired problem. Like, you're bringing people in and you can help solve it together. And even if solving it is resetting expectations with the street or with the board or with the investors, that's better to proactively do as a team than having bad news on one day. I think the second thing, and then I'll let Laura make some comments. The second thing is live in the world you live in versus the world you wish it were. And I think way too many people that I've interacted with tell me what they think I want to hear and the way they wish the world was. Yeah, I wish it was that too, and I'd like a pony and a new Porsche, and yeah, but no, yeah, there's a lot of macro headwinds. There's a lot of challenges. Like, let's have the hard conversations and work through it together, because at the end of the day, that's why the board is there. I mean, they've got a lot of responsibilities, but a big piece of it is to bring different perspectives and ideas to help solve the hardest problems. So I would just say those two things on my end.
Yeah, I could not agree more with the call a problem early. I do that. I want my team to do it. The sooner we know it, the sooner we can solve it. And if you know it too late, you just cannot fix the problem. And so it is incredibly important to do that and to use your management team, use your board, to help work through that with you and make it an us problem, not just like a me problem. It's also, by the way, just like the weight on you will be better if you can, talk about that stuff with other people. I guess the other thing is just like, I think, and maybe this is a little bit living in the real world, like, it's okay to pivot. It's like actually okay to have been wrong.
Yeah.
Right. And to say, you know what, we believe this. And I came to 2 board meetings ago with like this deep conviction and all of this clarity and all this data. And turns out we were wrong. Turns out the assumption was wrong, or turns out the world has changed or the market has changed or whatever. And being able to pivot quickly and like cut your losses and not worry about sunk costs, and then just like look at the more recent data and continue with that big aspirational vision and but pivot it. Like, I think the best companies do that well and do it quickly and do it a decent amount of time, because it's not, what we're all trying to do is not easy, like these are hard jobs. We have big ambitions. We have big goals. Like, God knows you guys have more guts than I do to do the like phase 1 stuff, like it's hard work and
the world's changing around you.
Totally.
As you're doing this. They've got different expectations. You got geopolitical crisis. You've got hard landing, soft landing. And so it is hard.
And I think that, a board doesn't judge a leader for that. I think a board actually sort of really respects a leader for doing that. And, that's okay.
Awesome. Well, with that, I think it's going to be lunchtime. So Laura, thank you so much for making time in your busy schedule.
Well, thank you.
This was fun.
This was so fun.